Good evening, everyone. We're going to get started. I'm using a microphone because we're recording and we have it streaming, so if anyone at home is watching, and so they can only hear me on the microphone. So I know for the few people in here, you could hear me otherwise. My name is Dr. Settery, and I am the project manager for the Curriculum Instruction and Assessment Office. And one of the things that I help do is our parent universities. So I just want to let you know our next parent university is about how to be a math person and have your child be one too, and that'll be October 29th, and it'll be here.
I just want to say that's amazing because I'm with the IE Working Moms Group and we had lunch today and that was actually one of the topics of conversation, how we wish there was some place we could go to learn more about the math and how we can help
Yes,
our child.
October 29th, here, 6 o'clock. Perfect place to be. And Dr. Lori Ferry will be leading that one, and she's an expert in math and instruction, and she's going to be wonderful. So super excited about that. So mark your calendars. And if you are on the Parent University Parent Square or Facebook page, you'll get information. This is streaming live on YouTube, and to anybody who's at home and wanting to put comments in, we are looking at those. You might have to click subscribe in order to do your comment. That was just a safety protocol that we put in place. So if anyone needs the restroom, it's over here. And then here's Dr. Mark A. Winston to lead us today.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Stacy. We appreciate that. We're really excited about offering this opportunity. This will be one of several sessions that we're going to be doing during the course of the school year to really focus on helping our public, our community, our families, and our staff members to understand school finance, which we know is pretty complex. We really want you to understand how is it that the school district can afford to do this, but they maybe can't afford to do something else? And what are the various funding sources, and how does that come about? So those are just a few of the questions that we hope to answer this evening. But before we get started, I would like to ask each of my co-presenters to introduce themselves and tell you just a little bit about their background and their expertise in this particular area.
Good evening. I'm John Kenny. I'm the Chief Financial Officer for Monroe County Community School Corporation. I've been with the district approaching 8 years and been through COVID and a lot of funding and legislative changes over that period of time.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Jeff Hammond. I'm with Baker Tilly. We serve as the school corporation's municipal financial advisor, and I've been doing so since 2020. I'm a proud IU alum, so it's always good to be back in Bloomington. And I've been working with K-12 schools and libraries across the state of Indiana in this capacity for about 10 years.
My name's Tom Bunger. I am with Bunger and Robertson. Excuse me. We have been general counsel to the school corporation for quite some time. In that capacity, I've worked with the folks at Baker Tilly. I've worked with John on numerous bond issues and projects and funding. So it's something I'm familiar with and have practiced now for 48 years. Yeah.
Thank you so very much. So there are a number of topics that we're going to cover this evening. As you entered, you should have received a note card. So as you think of different questions, please feel free to fill out those cards. We will make sure that Dr. Setti will be collecting those, and we'll make sure to share those with the panel. We already have a couple of questions that were submitted online, so we're really excited to get started with this. So big big topics that we're going to be talking about. Just a big picture overview of how does school finance work? What is the overview of school funding? And then how do our property taxes, which we've all experienced, how does that impact the school district and the funding requirements that exist? And I think the other piece that's going to go along with all of that is what are the limitations and the requirements of the various funding sources that are part of school finance? So I want to turn it over to John Kenny, our CFO.
Thank you. The first slide shows the 5 funds. There's actually 6 because there's 2 debt service funds. But we'd like to start with the education fund, which is state funded. What we mean by state funded is the difference between state funded and locally funded. The locally funded buckets or funds are property tax funded, which is taxed locally, and the state funded is through state taxes and distributed to us mid-month each month throughout the year. So the education fund is the state funded fund that we consider part of our budgeted funds or our state-approved budgeted funds, getting a levy and/or an agreed upon amount to operate for the next year through the state each year. The debt service fund is a property tax fund. The two operating referendum funds that the Monroe County Community School Corporation has are locally funded. And the operations fund is locally funded as well. We have an arrow showing that there's a connection between the education fund and the operations fund. As part of state legislation, we have the ability to transfer up to 15% of the dollars in our education fund to the operations fund in any given year. The education fund has as its allowable uses teacher wages and benefits and education supplies. As I said before, up to 15% of the state aid may be transferred to the operations fund, but that is the key statement for the education fund, is that is predominantly for teacher wages and benefits. The education fund, as a state fund, receives its revenue through the five bullet points, if you will, listed here on this slide. Each month we get 1/12 of our state distribution, and that distribution is made up of the basic grant, which is an amount that combines your ADM, which is your average daily membership, which is in some sense the number of students enrolled at your school on a particular day, and that is then multiplied by the legislatively given amount per student, and that comes up with the basic tuition or basic grant amount that goes into the funding formula. That is approximately 90% of the amount you get each month. The remaining 4 involve academic performance incentive grants. We formerly had thought of it as the honors grant, the special education grant, the CTE grant, which is the Hoosier Hills funding in our community, and most recently a very small amount for the NESP grant.
So one of the things that Mr. Kinney was talking about is ADM. We know that there are 2 times during the course of the school year that the Indiana Department of Education takes account of how many students are enrolled in your schools. The primary count date happens on October 1st, or happens at the beginning of October. Is it exactly the 1st?
Depends on the weekend.
Yeah. So, and then the second one happens in February. And so the data that we're going to share with you tonight is specifically related to the October count, because that's a consistent point in time that we know year over year over year that we'll be able to look at our data. So if you look at this slide, you'll see in 2019, 2020, our student enrollment numbers based upon our October ADM count of the fall of 2019 was 10,897 students. When you look at the next ADM count, which is the fall of 2020, and we all know what happened in 2020, COVID, we had a pretty significant decline down to, I can barely see the numbers, 10,361. And so that is a significant impact on the finances of any school corporation to lose that many students. We kind of bounced back a little bit in 2021, 2022, went back up a few students. And if you look at the last 3 columns there, you'll see 2022, 23, 23, 24. And then right now, we do not have our current ADM count until the October count. So sometime next week, we'll know exactly what that count is going to be. So it's really imperative that students that are residing within our community and are planning on attending our schools are in school, because that date matters for all the funding that any school or corporation in the entire state of Indiana. That's what really drives, like John was indicating, approximately 90% of our funding from state aid. The next slide really is a little bit more complicated, but I'm going to speak on a couple pieces of it, and then Mr. Kinney's going to speak on it a little bit further. So what you'll see here is you'll see the red line. So I'm going to speak on the red line. So what you saw previously had to do with our ADM numbers. And so the red line here also depicts the ADM. But what we've also included on this slide is the revenue that has been received. So the significant point is, as you see the decline of the enrollment over the last several years from 2019, 2020 to now, and what we're anticipating, that's a significant piece of information that helps school districts anticipate and plan for budgeting. And so Mr. Kinney's going to talk a little bit more about the additional calculations that go into the numbers that you see at the top of the columns.
Thank you. The blue bars show the total state aid that was part of the 5 bullet points from the earlier slide. The main 90% portion of that, roughly 90%, is the basic tuition support or the state aid, where it takes your ADM times the per pupil amount to get the funding for that year. And then the remainder is made up of the formerly honors grant, the NESP, the CTE for Hoosier Hills, and the special education grant. So the top of those columns shows how much money we received in state aid for each of those years. Now, it might seem just a little counterintuitive to see ADM drop, but for the most part, the blue bars go up, even if very slightly. And the concept there is that the state gives a higher per pupil amount each year based on legislation. So if the percentage of increase to the per pupil amount exceeds the percentage of loss in your enrollment ADM, it's still going to go up, just not as much as maybe a steady ADM would have done otherwise. This slide shows the sort of what I talked about at the end. We decided to show that if we had not had enrollment loss or enrollment decline, what might we have looked like or expected financially, and some of the challenges we will face longer term by having a slightly lower enrollment than our peak year of 2019-2020, where ADM was 10,897. This slide shows in the green bar in the first column at the left, that's the 10,897. And the blue bar is actual. So in the baseline year, they're the same. We had revenue above 60,000 in the basic tuition support, both by the 10,897 and the actual amount received. So then as you come across, the green bar is, well, if we had stayed at 10,897, what would we have received? And it's fairly reasonable historically to assume a district holds steady. Some increase, some slight decrease, but a little bit different with the COVID drop and then some of the legislative things that have happened since then to put a lot of school districts in a little bit of a declining mode. But this shows that in the first year after, had we held steady at 10,897, we would have had about 3.7 million in additional funds that year. The year after that, the reason the green bar is slightly creeping up is because the state gave a higher per pupil amount in that year. So even though the ADM is holding steady, the higher pupil amount leads to a higher revenue amount. So then we would have had a loss of 3.7 had we compared it to a steady enrollment. The next year, 4.6. The following year, 5.2, for a cumulative loss to date under that theory of $17.2 million over 4 years. The final two bars at the right are what we expect this year with the information we have at the moment. That if comparison from 10,897 to our current projection prior to the October 1st count date, we are estimating in the theory that had we held steady in ADM, we would lose 5.2 million to that theoretical baseline. So these are some of the things we're working towards, thinking about, and trying to manage towards in terms of not really revenue loss, but kind of a decline from our peak revenue and what it might have meant had we maintained that. The operations fund is the sort of fund that works together with the education fund. It pays a lot of district salaries and hourly worker wages. It's funded based on levy, tax rate, and assessed valuation. Allowable uses per state code include technology, staff, annual maintenance, everything that goes in that to keep the buildings updated, transportation, buses, bus driver wages, and all equipment needs that don't rise to the level of potentially bonding if they're large enough equipment needs that we might need to get excess funds for them. This transfer of 15% comes into the operations fund as needed, and this is a fund that can be affected heavily by circuit breaker, which we'll talk about a little bit more later. But in a sense, when you have 1%, 2%, 3% property caps in legislation from, I believe, 2008, anything above the cap is considered lost in a sense. You never get it, but it existed in some sense and comes back as a reduction to what you might have otherwise expected, and that loss is referred to in some sense as the circuit breaker as we perceive it.
Can I make one additional comment on the operations fund? So one other thing with the operations fund that creates unique challenges for school corporations as well is that the levy that the school can put in place each year is actually capped by the state. So next year that can only grow by 4%. If you all looked around the last few years and noticed what inflation did, it outpaced 4% growth. However, you could only levy for an additional 4% each year. So that's another constraint that schools have had to deal with over the last few years as well, only being able to grow that fund by so much when expenses have exceeded that. So it's just another constraint that has to be dealt with in the operations fund. Thanks.
The next two slides will cover our two referendum funds. Again, local property taxes provide the funding. Different from the operations fund, the circuit breaker legislation does not affect the referendum funds because they're off of gross assessed valuation, not net assessed valuation. So they aren't limited by any 1%, 2%, 3% caps that might be in operations fund or debt service funds. They have to be approved at the local level by voters. A maximum tax rate is approved by the voters. And then recent legislative changes have reduced the, we call it the will of the voter, because after we got approved of an 18.5-cent tax rate, they have put a cap on that referendum fund. So we're anticipating a 17.33-cent tax rate this year, when that wasn't what we thought when the voters passed the legislation or passed a referendum on the ballot. The legislator came in, not specifically to us, but to referendum funds in place and capped them after the fact. So, and then another fact is that operating referendum are limited to an 8-year cycle, at which point they have to be revoted on, sort of as if you're starting over. In 2023, as sort of repeat of what I said, the state of Indiana enacted a cap on property taxes. In 2024, we did not reach that cap, so it didn't limit us. In a sense, our AV growth was under the cap amount, so we got the full AV growth. But for this upcoming tax year in 2025, we estimate we'll lose $1.3 million. We will still get increases, but not to the level we would have previously thought based on our AV growth. So somewhat disappointing. The debt service fund is another local property tax fund. It's used to pay debt service issued to fund capital projects. Examples of projects include HVAC, boilers, chillers, roofs, roof repairs, furniture, carpet, building additions, renovations, but mostly for the use of the district, new construction, whether it be a full new building or major construction repairs. The bonds that we issue can be general obligation bonds. first mortgage bonds, which are also called in our jargon lease rental bonds or building corporation bonds. And then there can be capital referendas that are some of the tools used to finance the projects. Some of our most recent bonds issued since 2020, we issue basically one a year, but some years we do one spring, one fall, based on needs and vision and ability to go to bonds as a funding source. But the first one was about 54 million. That was whenever they get larger, they're that building corp lease rental first mortgage bond issuance. 2020 we did 12 million, 21, 5 million, 22, 12.9 million, 23, 25.5 million, and earlier this year 5.8 million as some of the history of bonds I've been involved with and bonds that were issued to fund a variety of projects in the district. Those projects include as highlights the first bond listed built Tri-North Middle School along with Bloomington North's Aquatic Center. We've also rebuilt Bloomington High School South's Aquatic Center. We built a Unionville amphitheater. There's been multiple athletic turf projects and multiple solar projects that include Bloomington High School South, Bloomington High School North, and Lakeview Elementary School. Here's some of the pictures of the funding from debt service and bonds that we've been able to implement since I've been here. So the left being Tri-North from the entranceway, top right being Bloomington South Aquatic Center, and lower right being the Unionville Amphitheater. And then Mr. Hammond will talk about the property taxes. And again, feel free as your thoughts arise to ask a question either now or at the end as well.
Before Mr. Hammond gets going, does anybody have any questions right now based on what you've heard so far? Or even any comments on what you've heard so far? We have a comment maybe up here in the front.
I was just wondering, given the uncertainty of how much you'll get each year, when is the budget set for the school year?
Great question. John, you want to take that?
Yeah. Uncertainty comes in about 3 different levels, but for the most part, we're estimating ADM to determine the education fund revenues that will come in. There's usually sort of enough leeway in terms of budget doesn't have to be to the dollar exact. So if we're a little higher in our expenses to give us room to adjust as the year progresses for needs and teacher increases, et cetera, which we have pretty well targeted. The same holds for the revenue a little bit, that we do a best estimate with state guidance. We talk about ADM and where we think it'll come in. We're monitoring where it is leading up to October 1st. So we have a pretty good estimate, but it could come in 100 students lower, maybe 700,000 if you do the math. But we're talking about an $85 million fund. So there's ways to manage little, not quite exactness in the education fund. In terms of property taxes, from a budget point of view, we know what our assessed valuation will be. Legislatively, it's required to be given to us by August 1st, but it varies when we actually get it. There some nail biting this year when it came on August 9th, because we have a board meeting where we start presenting the budget. But usually we have everything in line, and the assessed valuation, we know how much we need to spend for wages and other items in operations fund, debt service fund. Our debt is kind of laid out for the future years, so we know what we need. So the only 2 factors we're waiting on is how high will the assessed valuation be, so that we can put that number in and the tax rate is quickly determined off of that. So whenever the assessed valuation is higher, absent caps, the tax rate will come down. based on that. So we set the budget, we estimate the revenue, and we wait for the assessed valuation for the local tax funds for August 1st to sort of finish the picture of the operations fund, the referendum funds, and the debt service fund. So that's the flow a little bit. Jeff lives in that world with multiple districts. If there's anything you want to add to that, that's
No, I think
okay.
you nailed it.
Okay, thanks.
All right, so my portion this evening is going to focus on property tax, just a property tax overview. So we heard about how schools are funded with ADM from the state. That's largely outside of the school corporation's control. But when it comes to the local property taxes, that is more within their control. And so one place I want to start is just with kind of an overview of some common terms. You've probably heard a few of these already thrown out by us as we've been talking. So I think that's a good place to start to just give an idea of what some of this lingo and the words that we use actually means. So the first is a tax levy. And think of the levy as the amount of taxes to be collected for a specific fund. And there's a formula that determines that tax levy. It is the tax rate times the NAV or the net assessed value, which I'll talk about here shortly. So again, think of the levy as the amount that the school corporation needs to go out and request and levy on the taxpayers to then fund the specific funds that they need. Tax caps, or also called circuit breaker, this is a relatively Indiana specific concept. I don't believe there are many other states in the country that utilize tax caps. So that adds a little extra nuance to the Indiana property taxes. But in some districts and some municipalities across the state, these circuit breaker caps create a lot of issues and can become a really big deal when it comes to collecting the money that you need to collect. So the tax caps is basically it's in the Indiana Constitution, and there are three different caps that apply here. So these caps essentially limit the amount that you pay as a property tax payer based on a percentage of your gross assessed value, and there's three different categories for these. The first one is residential property. So as a residential property tax payer, your tax liability each year is capped at 1% of your gross assessed value. So the gross assessed value, which I'll get into a little more down the slide here, but think about that as it's supposed to be very close to the market value of your home, and it's the assessed value before you take into account some deductions that the state of Indiana allows you to do as a residential property taxpayer. So big picture with the 1% cap, you've got residential property, and you should only be paying 1% of your gross assessed value. Anything that you might owe above that 1% cap is a credit to you, but it is actually a shortfall to the municipality that needs to collect that revenue. And the state of Indiana really limits the ways that you can remedy that shortfall. So what that means is oftentimes school corporations, cities, towns that experience a lot of circuit breaker loss simply have to find a way in their budget to work around that and do with less. The agricultural, rental property, and long-term care classified properties are capped at 2% of their gross assessed value. And then for industrial and commercial properties, it's capped at 3% of the gross assessed value. So circuit breaker is something, again, it's in the Constitution, so it's not going to go anywhere unless they amend it. But it applies to really all property tax payers, whether it's an individual owning a home or if it's a business. Again, the main takeaway there is that you cannot collect above that cap, even if it's needed by your levy. The tax rate, so this is, it's in dollars, it's expressed per $100 of assessed value. And tax rate and tax levy are very closely related. And you can see in the formula here for how you determine tax rate that it relies pretty heavily on what the tax levy is. So to determine your tax rate, you simply take the levy needed divided by the net assessed value of the district. Assessed value, that is the total value of all real and personal property within a municipality's district. So think about that as really the entire tax base. So that's made up of residential, commercial, agriculture, all that is comprised and makes up the gross assessed value or the assessed value. And then you have net assessed value, which takes into account exemptions that are available to you to deduct, especially on the residential side of things that the state of Indiana gives you. And so you start at your gross assessed value, take into account the deductions, and you arrive at your net assessed value. And that net assessed value is what the tax rate is based on and levied off of. So, probably one of the most important variables to the equation is that net assessed value. And then there is a maximum levy. So I mentioned this when it came to the operations fund. Most most property tax funded funds are capped by a levy or a levy quotient. So you would take the next year or the last year's levy, and if we're talking about the operations fund, the school could grow that by 4% the next year. So it's not a situation where a school could say, we're at a 50-cent tax rate in the operations fund. We'd love that to be 60 cents next year. That can't happen. You can only grow your levy by the 4%. And then if the net assessed value growth for that year is outpacing that levy growth, then the tax rate would actually drop, given the way that the formulas work to determine those.
And Jeff, that amount is adjusted every year, correct?
Correct.
So you find that out, I know it was August 1st when you get the one, when is that typically identified? Is there a time period
So
or calendar year?
yeah, I'm not sure the exact time that it's released. It's released around the budgeting time, and it's typically based on a formula that determines that growth quotient. However, the last few years, because assessed values have risen so quickly, the state has come in and actually just capped that and determined that that growth quotient is going to be 4%. So they've kind of taken the formula away and just capped it at 4%. So, to assess value. So again, this is it serves as the basis for all tax rates. It's comprised of both real and personal property, and it's talked about in terms of $100 of assessed value whenever you're talking about tax rates. So the current system for determining the net assessed value or just the assessed value in general is done at the county level. So if you own a home, you get that notification every year that tells you what your assessment is on your property. It is supposed to be in the state of Indiana very closely correlated to the market value of your property. So when you see your assessment, it should be relatively close to what you could sell your home for. It's not always the case, but it's supposed to be pretty close. There are annual adjustments that are made, often called trending. Those may be applied across the board in a county, but typically a county assesses 25% of their property each year. So your individual property should be really thoroughly reassessed every 4 years as they go 25% each year. So, what can cause changes in assessed valuation? So, we kind of hit on that a little bit. How that number, your net assessed value, is released every supposed to be August 1st, but that's released every year, and that number changes every year. So there are a few things that can cause those changes. So trending, which I kind of mentioned on the prior slide, just kind of trying to adjust for market values across the board. So that can cause your net assessed value to change. There's the general reassessment that I mentioned on the prior slide. So a 4-year cycle, about a fourth of the property within the county is assessed every year. If there's additional development in the district, so that could be new houses coming in, it could be businesses coming in and opening up. Those can lead to changes in assessed value. If there's a large employer or a large taxpayer that closes shop or relocates, having that on the tax rolls for that business and then they close down, again, tied to that market value concept, that could significantly cause the net assessed value to drop. Taxpayers have the ability to appeal their assessment. So if there are large companies in the boundaries that are unhappy and think that they're being taxed too much, they can appeal that, and that may lower their tax assessed value, which could lower the school corporation's assessed value. Changes to deductions and exemptions. We'll talk through this a little bit in a couple slides. There was a recent change to this. There are a lot more changes being discussed that could potentially limit assessed value in this next legislative session. We'll kind of watch and see how that plays out, but those changes to the deductions and exemptions can certainly affect your assessed value. Assessed value appeals, already kind of mentioned that one. And then there's two other things that come into play oftentimes when you're talking about economic development, and that's tax increment. You may have heard the acronym TIF before, Tax Increment Finance District. That can certainly impact assessed value, and then tax abatements. So oftentimes, if a city or a town wants to entice a large company to come in for jobs and for that tax base, they may give them an abatement. It might be a 10-year abatement where they just slowly phase up to their full assessed value and therefore their full tax bill. But that may be 5-10 years before that full value comes on and the school corporation or any other overlapping unit gets to benefit from that. So with property classification, so think about when you're thinking of your assessed value, I like to think about it as kind of like a big slice or a big piece of pizza. I like pizza, so that's an easy way for me to think about it. And if you're thinking of like a pie chart, you've got your whole pizza or your whole pie, which comprises the assessed value of the district. But then there are little categories within that that determine that total assessed value. And so those classifications can impact things like the circuit breaker caps mainly that we hit on a little bit ago. But it really just determines your total tax base and what that mix looks like. So those classifications are agricultural land, there's business, commercial, and industrial, which would be subject to that 3% circuit breaker cap. There's residential property, utilities, and then tax exempt property. So all of those make up your assessed value, specifically your gross assessed value, but that comprises the total tax base of a school district or a municipality. And so then I kind of alluded to going from your gross assessed value to that net assessed value that your tax liability is actually based on. And the main differences in that is that with your gross assessed value, that's all of the property. It's also personal property, and it includes things like railroads and utilities as well. Then when you get to your net assessed value, it takes into account tax exempt property, so that would be netted out of the gross assessed value, and then also any deductions or exemptions that those properties could claim. So when you're looking at your annual tax bill that you get, this slide here kind of demonstrates how that bill is determined. Now, it's a little more nuanced than this, especially when you get into a referendum, because that's outside of the tax caps, and it kind of complicates your tax bill if you're trying to do it at home a little bit more. But you start with your gross assessed value. So again, that's supposed to be close to the market value of your home. Then you've got deductions available to you through the state of Indiana. And there used to be 3, but a couple years ago they did away with the mortgage deduction and actually combined it into the standard deduction. So how these work is with the standard homestead deduction, you're able to deduct the lesser of $45,000 or 60% of your home value. So you'd have your gross assessed value, you could take that standard deduction right off the top. Then there's a supplemental homestead deduction, which allows you to deduct an additional 35% from your gross value. So you've got gross value, subtract off the standard deduction, take 35% of that, and that gets you from your gross assessed value to your net assessed value. And then that net assessed value times your tax rate divided by 100 is your gross tax liability or tax bill. You would then look at that and see how that comes into play with your circuit breaker. Most of the time, the circuit breaker caps don't become a problem until your total tax rate. So it would be the school corporation, the city, the town, a library, all those taxing districts that make up what you pay your taxes on. When that gets over $2, usually is when you start to see those circuit breakers come into play pretty heavily. So just a few more slides here. Some general correlations. If assessed value increases in a school, so let's say that the school's assessed value increases by 10% in a year and the levy is remaining the same, you would expect the tax rate to decrease. And that's just the way the formula is set up. Holding the levy to constant, assessed value increases, the tax rate decreases. If the assessed value decreases and your levy remains the same, then you would expect the tax rate to increase. So it's just kind of a correlation there, that they move in the opposite direction. And then specifically when it comes to circuit breakers, if the tax rate decreases in a given year, typically you would expect to see less circuit breaker loss to the district because that tax rate is dropping. You're going to have less properties hitting up against that cap, and therefore those credits would decrease. If the tax rates increase, I mentioned specifically that $2, when you start getting up above $2 in total rates, when you really start to notice it. But if tax rates are increasing, then you see circuit breaker credits increase, which again can lead to those shortfalls with what a school or a city or town needs to collect and what they can actually collect. So just some general correlations with how those interplay with the tax rate.
I've been given the opportunity to share the key takeaways, but Jeff, just a question for you. In Bloomington, we'll see people wanting to talk about the tax increment districts, and that also can impact the funds available to a school corporation. Is that fair?
That is fair. So TIF areas, tax increment, it is a hot button issue usually. Oftentimes, school corporations are not in favor of a lot of TIF areas because what they do, and again, I could spend a lot of time on this, so I'm going to be brief. What they do is they establish a base assessed value for a specific district, and that's determined at year one. Then they, as development and infrastructure and things occur, that assessed value theoretically will increase. However, the school corporation cannot capture that increase. They can only capture the base. And the idea is that that increase in assessed value allows the TIF districts to then issue bonds and to fund improvements in that district that would then entice businesses or development to occur. But it really caps the assessed value for a school district for 20 to 25 years, depending on the life of the TIF area. So there are situations where a TIF area can pass through assessed value or pledge actual dollars, but typically what it does is it limits that assessed value growth, which, thinking about that slide with the correlations, you can see how that could all come into play when it comes to a school's budget and the money they need to collect.
All right, the takeaways. The first takeaway, and you can look at the slides and you can see the three funds. I think the bottom key is what's allowable, and these are three separate funds. And John and Jeff have talked about how the funds exist and what they can be used for. And if you're short in one fund, it's not an option to take money from that to meet the other. So the one exception that John pointed out is the education fund that pays for teachers' wages and benefits. It's possible to take up to 15% of that fund and put it into the operation fund. I think John shared with me we've never had to take that much. A small percentage occasionally on a year we would do that. The debt service fund, that pays debt obligations, capital projects funds, and again, that can be GO bonds, general obligation bonds, which are based upon the assessed value. And again, when the state code determines there are percentages of amounts that GO bonds that the school corporation is entitled to issue, and then That amount is limited. That's paid from the debt service fund. Then a school building corporation, which is another entity that's formed, they actually enter into a financing agreement. They lease the building back to the schools. The building corporation owns the property. The school is leasing it back. The payments are equal to the debt on that. But that's another way to raise funds, and that comes from the debt service. Then the operation fund, which is based upon, for staff, it says staff maintenance equipment related to the operations of the school. That's what the tax rate is based upon, and the property tax amount that comes to you. And to say that the Indiana State Code determines allowable spending is an understatement. John made the point that we, as a community, passed a referendum. The community said, we believe that we need to spend X for this referendum. The state legislature said, we're thankful for what the Monroe County Community School Corporation patrons voted for. However, we don't think you're entitled to that amount, and basically cut the amount that we as a community said we were able to pay. I've been around here a long time. Our school community has been very interested and very favorable and done everything they can to assist our community and our schools. And it's somewhat frustrating when we put something out that somebody says, because they're limiting you. When we say the state code determines the amount spendable, that's true. And we are caught within those constraints. And the question was asked of John about the budget. If you watched the board meeting last night, the budget process has started. There will be hearings. The numbers are there. It's available. This is all public. And one of the intents tonight is to give people the opportunity to understand that there are funds. And we've all heard somebody say, well, you've got dollars over here. Those dollars over there, they're not available for that. You are restricted on what you can use those funds for. And you have to understand that within certain limitations, when the budget is set and John puts that together, it's got to be within those constraints. But the other thing to recognize is it's a public process. A GO bond issue that we talked about. There are hearings with that. There are legal notices. There's opportunity to question. There's opportunity to appear. One of the things the state legislature has been very intentional about is to make sure that people have the opportunity and are given notice. Whether or not they take advantage of it is up to the individual. But the fact is they want to make it clear that before you do something, you're going to let the public know. So with that, I think we'd like to leave it an opportunity for people to raise questions.
Anybody has a card, and I can ask where you can ask directly. Do you have another question? Do you want to ask me?
No, I can ask it. I have funny handwriting. First of all, so helpful and makes me realize the extent to which you all are so very reliant on the county assessor. Wow. Maybe a silly question, but let's say, I pay $5,000 a year for my property taxes. Does all of that go to the school? Does it go to other places?
It's a great question. So it will go to other places. So I kind of mentioned in a prior slide that you've got a total tax rate that you're going to see. So you won't, unless you really get into the detail of your tax bill, you won't see what percentage goes to the school, what percentage goes to the library, what percentage goes to the city. So there are multiple different taxing units that make up your taxing district that determines your tax bill. The school corporation usually does make up the largest percentage of most people's tax bills, but to your point, it does not all go to the school. It will get divided up and sent out to whatever those individual levies and rates are associated with each of those taxing units. So it goes a lot of different places.
Your follow-up?
I have a follow-up. Referendums. I thought that it was in addition to the property taxes. and just a community could come together and decide 1% is not enough in our community. We would like to raise that, and that was the ability to kind of get around that circuit breaker. Is that not true?
That's that is partially true. So
Okay.
yeah, anytime that a referendum is in place, and there's two different types. There's the operating referendum, which school corporation has in place. There's also a capital referendum. So those could be used to issue bonds and that actually fund a capital related project. So they are outside of the circuit breaker caps. So that is a way to work around. You have some school districts that are so affected by circuit breaker, they basically don't have a choice other than to try for a referendum to get outside of those caps. So it is outside of the caps. But what's happened is in the last few years, instead of allowing a school corporation on an operating referendum, because what's on the ballot is a tax rate that's approved. What's happened is they've tried to limit property tax bills because assessed values have increased so much. So they've restricted and not allowed schools to levy that full rate that was approved. They've based it on last year's budget and levy and then said you can only grow by this percent. So in the last probably 2 years we've seen that. It's really limited the amount that a school can collect instead, so they can't levy that full tax rate that was approved.
So, off of that referendum question, so you'd mentioned that the referendum expires after 8 years. I know that you have to look at this year, but you also have to look at the future of the school corporation. What sort of planning goes into place when you know that a referendum is getting ready to expire in terms of creating a new referendum, or do you focus on another area and say, okay, now we'll shift that money over to, cover school supplies now that that one has run out, or whatever the case may be? How do you strategize on that?
We, as a district, a little before I got here, in 2010, did the first referendum. I believe at that point there were 6-year limits. So in 2016, it was renewed, still a 6-year limit. So in 2022, we were approved under the first 8-year limit. The part of the planning I was in at that time, it was a follow-up in the 2016, so I know a lot of the planning, even if I wasn't a part of it. But the 2022 planning had to do with, do we want to continue? Do we want to continue at the same levels? What other goals might we have? What other financial considerations are in place here at the district that we might want to help with? And it became clear early on in that process that the main focus was increasing teacher and staff wages. So that referendum and its increase, because the state makes you call them new referendum, but even though if you have one and the community wants to keep it going, there's some sense that you could think of it as a continuing referenda. So we wanted to continue with what we had in place and put in increases for certain amounts desired to give to teachers for increases, and then corresponding amounts to give to hourly staff in terms of $2.25 an hour, which is the ballpark, very close equivalent to the teacher raise of $4,500. So there was a lot of planning as to what do we need our tax rate to be to cover this amount per teacher for the next year, and then continuing, as well as a few other things that were thought of in that referendum. And then a lot of transparency with the community to go talk to groups and constituents, parents, other taxpayers, to say what our intent was, why we wanted to do it, and to make sure we followed all the legal requirements behind the scenes, which are numerous, and head towards a successful vote, successful referendum. The second one, it's the same planning and process, but it was for early childhood education. It was a different purpose. So it was determining how much would be needed, what the rate would need to be, projected AVs to get that rate. There was a lot of study as to how much do you need to fund certain levels of pre-K involvement, little bit of fully funded if you're at a certain level of income. But I think the lowest we ever got was at least half funded. So a lot of background as to what do you need to do that? What does that translate to into terms of a referendum and a tax rate and and then sticking to it once we were fortunate enough to have the community support it by passing the vote last November.
And John, just a question that I don't think people also realize. When we create a referendum, there actually is an account. You can show where those dollars are. Otherwise, it's not dollars thrown into the general fund. It's not dollars thrown in. There is a separate line item, and people want to see where those dollars go. You account and can show that. I think it's
Correct.
important people to know that.
And we can pretty much at any time show that we are, and we're very diligent in following what we told people that we would spend the money on, and we don't go outside those boundaries for transparency, for integrity, for trying to represent honesty with the constituents and the citizens, that we appreciate it and we're doing what we said we would.
I just want to say thank you to our panel this evening. This was very helpful. Hopefully you have begun to see just a little bit of the complexity that's involved in school finance. There are so many moving parts. I appreciated the questions about how do you set priorities? How do you know where to put the dollars? And as you've listened to everyone at the table here, you should begin to understand how assessed value is impacting this, how student enrollment increases or declines are certainly impacting our funding, the various tax rates, the different pieces of legislation that have passed and impact exactly what we're able to do, and then just the creativity and flexibility that we have to undergo to try to figure out how are we going to make sure that we can fulfill our obligations. It's not an easy task, and it is truly a 24/7 effort. And while we had our first 2025 budget hearing last evening, you can be assured that John and his team have been working tirelessly for weeks and months in preparation because there are so many unknowns and there are so many other factors that are impacting what our revenue is going to look like, and then of course making sure that all of our employees are well taken care of, that we are honoring the confidence from our community with our referenda dollars. It's very complex. And so tonight was just a very first step in beginning to educate our entire community around what this process looks like. We anticipate having future conversations. And I think, just to kind of close out, one of the conversations or one of the questions that we have received time and again is, how is it, and I'm just going to use this as an example, how is it that you're able to build that facility or that playground when we know that we would really much prefer to have teacher salaries go up? Well, we'd all like to see our teacher salaries go up, and we're appreciative to our community that we were able to give our teachers a raise back in 2022. But we also recognize, perhaps differently tonight, that because of the different funding buckets that Mr. Kinney went through, you can't utilize those dollars to pay teacher salaries and vice versa. And so this is just one step in the process for us to continue to be even more transparent about funding sources, how we gather the revenue, and how we're spending the revenue. We want to be as transparent as possible, and we want to make sure that we are fulfilling our fiscal responsibilities. So I just want to say thank you for being here this evening. For those of you who are online, thank you as well. I don't know if we have any concluding questions from online that we need to answer. I know some of the questions that were submitted prior to this evening, I think we've answered them. So one of the questions that was submitted previously is how is our funding raised and collected? I think we've addressed that. How is funding distributed? I think we've identified that as well. Somebody asked, will there be a recording? Absolutely. This will be posted on our website. And one question that I don't think we got to yet is there a way for the community to see what spending initiatives are on the table or coming down the pike? We're working on that as we speak. All of these factors influence what we're going to be able to do. And so Mr. Kinney and I meet pretty regularly to identify future projects. We meet with other members of our operations team, our facilities team. And so one of the things that I anticipate doing is in the next several months, finalizing the development of an ongoing facilities plan. And so a multi-year facilities plan so that we can kind of lay out over the next several years what are the priorities for our facilities and what do we need to start with first. So we have some small projects that are currently underway or will shortly be underway, but we also are looking multiple years out. So thank you again for being here. Hopefully this sheds some light. Hopefully it raises some questions for you. And hopefully you'll be able to attend a future session where we'll dig even deeper into some of these very same topics. So thank you. Thanks everyone for being here.
Thank you, everyone. There are feedback forms if you'd like to fill it out. There's a little basket up on the way out. And if you have any questions later, feel free to email parentview@mccsc.edu. And this presentation will be posted